You're listening to Proven Perspectives, a podcast with John Hawkins, the founder of Leadership Edge. I'm Laura, John's daughter, and in each episode, we'll explore a topic related to life, leadership, or mentoring. Through over 50 years of faith in Christ, John has learned proven life and leadership perspectives that will equip listeners for a lifestyle of leadership in their marriages, families, careers, communities, and churches. Hey, Dad.
Hey, Laura. It is always great to hear your voice.
It's always great to hear yours, too. How's your day going?
It has been full. It has been a full day of Zoom meetings. I'm about zoomed out. I've got one more after our recording, and then I'll be through a Zoom for the day. But great meetings and great privilege to get to be with the people I've been with today.
Well, I was wanting to tell you, we are cat sitting.
No.
For our neighbor.
Cat sitting.
Yeah, but here's the thing that made me think about you. So this
gosh.
neighbor is like a great neighbor, and our kids play together a lot. And so we have fed her cat before. So she asked me to do it again this time, and I was like, sure, no problem. So she had me come over for her to walk me through everything. And so the thing she said to me was, oh, and I forgot to tell you that since the last time you cat sit, our cat has become incontinent.
No.
Yeah, I am not going to go into all of that on the podcast.
So was she blaming you for that happening?
No. I didn't think that she was, maybe. But it totally reminded me of the kitty snot story, because I was like, okay, this is about to become a paid job.
So
anyways,
is the cat staying at their house?
The cat, no. Oh, yeah. The cat is definitely at their house.
Good.
Yeah. No, it's just a more involved process, let's just say. But anyways, it did remind me of the kitty snot story, which we haven't told in a while. We'll have to work that into an upcoming episode. So our neighbor, Barbara, her dog has diapers. And so I don't know if they make diapers for cats or not, but I mean, how would you get a cat? This is the most ridiculous conversation we've ever had on the podcast.
Yeah,
I don't think I want to try to get a cat in a
It's a Thursday in July, Oh,
yes. Man. Okay. Moving right along.
Yes.
So today we're talking about a topic that I know is a really important one to you. Uh-huh. So we're talking about friendship, and that's such a big topic. So today we're focusing specifically on the great value of a few good friends and looking specifically at male friendship. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
Okay, awesome. So Adam and I were joking that this is a little bit like the cybersecurity episode, where it's like, how in the world does someone as unqualified as I get co-hosting the episode on male friendship? But I will do the best that I can. So
you'll do great.
Yeah. So you had asked me to start off for people who have your book, Leadership as a Lifestyle, the opening story is from the chapter As Iron Sharpens Iron. So we're going to open by looking at that story. So,
okay.
So you wrote, it was a conversation that came too early and ended too soon. Two men, two friends, were awkwardly telling each other goodbye. John had flown out to Phoenix to visit Ken under the pretense of seeing Ken in his world. While there, John met Ken's friends and coworkers and had a great visit with Ken's family. However, the real reason John came was to tell his friend of 20 years that this would be their last time together. He had terminal cancer. Throughout the visit, his pain and weakness was a constant reminder of the conversation that they needed to have before John went home. But how do you begin such a conversation? How do you tell one of your best friends that you'll miss him? How do you tell him that you're a better man because of the friendship that you've shared? How do you explain all that you've learned from each other? How do you tell him how deeply you ache over leaving your wife and 4 children alone once you die? How do you talk about the transition plans that your firm is already beginning to ensure seamless profitability despite your abrupt departure? While John and Ken basked in the warm September sun, the conversation began. First came the facts, which were followed by the standard expressions of hope and optimism. And finally, the two friends stopped talking, looked at each other, and realized what they really wanted to say. They wanted to say thank you. From the day that they met in college, their friendship had been a wonderful blending of two very different men. They had challenged, competed, and learned from each other. Sometimes they disliked one another. As the years of their friendship grew, they increasingly became trusted friends and advisors to one another. They both had great aspirations for the kind of men, husbands, fathers, and professionals they wanted to become. Through their interactions and commitment to each other, they were unobtrusively helping the other become the man he wanted to be. And so now that their conversation was ending, all they knew how to say to each other was thank you, and that was all that needed to be said. As the taxi pulled up to take John to the airport, they hugged each other goodbye. Ken knew that he would never see John again in this life, and he also knew that as long as he lived, he would never forget their conversation. As the years since John's death have come and gone, Ken thinks of him often and visits the grave when he can, and every time he does, all he needs to say is thank you. So, Dad, I know you wrote that 22 years ago, and it was about one of your close friendships. So can you give us a little bit of the backstory on this and what it means to you?
Yeah, that is, I guess, one of my favorite stories. It's really one of the great friendships of my life. It was with a friend, John Bryce. And so in the story, he's John and I was Ken. I fictionalized it in some ways, but it's mostly a true story. John and I met in college. He was a varsity athlete on the football team. I was everything other than a varsity athlete on the football team.
Didn't meet on the team, huh?
No, but we met there, and in God's kindness, I helped John come to Christ, and that began a great friendship. And it was, again, a friendship of two very different men. We had grown up very differently, very different families, religious backgrounds. And it was a friendship that, had rough times. I'll never forget one time I was with John and he just looked at me dead in the eyes and said, I just want to make sure you understand, I don't want to be like you. I'm like, well, fine.
Whoa.
But, it was a time where, he was trying to figure out who he was going to be, and he saw kind of who I was, and in some ways was, rightly differentiating himself. But it was an honest relationship like that. And yet, as is said in the story, over the years, it really began to be a friendship of just trusted advice and care and interest and concern and pushing each other. And so he came out to see us that September, and then by sometime, I think in October, he was dead. And interestingly, I was asked to give the eulogy at his funeral. And that's quite a thing to have met this friend in college, and then 20 years later, you're standing in a church filled to standing room only, and giving the eulogy of your friend.
And his kids were so little.
Yeah, his kids, yeah. And yet, the impact of that friendship, both during those 20 years and really since then, as I reflect on it, it's a friendship that continues to shape me, to impact me, to kind of encourage me, to remind me as to the kind of man that God's called me to be. And John's buried, of course, he's in heaven, but he's buried in a cemetery in Raleigh out on Glenwood. And anytime I drive by there on Glenwood, I, just like the book says, I just say thank you. Because I think in the truly great friendships of your life, when it's time to say goodbye, I think the only thing you really need to say is thank you, because on the one hand, as two men, you don't owe each other anything. And then on the other hand, you owe each other so much. And so when I think of John, or when I drive by the cemetery, I definitely say thank you. Yeah.
So this is going back just a minute, but because I can't quite imagine, I haven't been in that situation yet of losing a close friend. What's one example of a way that his life, this 20 something years later, still impacts you?
Well, gosh, there's so many, but I think one is, we're going to be talking in this podcast. Men are not real great at building friendships, and especially men, after they get out of college or their late teen, early 20s. And I think the friendship with John just proved to me that two very different men who didn't live in the same state and who both were very busy, in what we call the go-go years. could still forge a friendship that really made a difference and that really made each of us a better man. And so I guess it proved to me it's possible, and it's really needed. And that it's really good to have friends that aren't just like you, that don't think just like you, but in this situation, that share the same fate.
Yeah. Man, that's really cool, because I don't know like exactly how much of you being this way flowed out of what you just described, but I feel like those are actually two of your great strengths in friendships are your ability to build friendships with like all different kinds of people, but especially like your capacity to maintain friendships. So that's just an interesting thing to think about, that having been impacted by him. But with what you were saying about like it gets more challenging after college, that was one thing when I was kind of brainstorming with Adam. Like I know I've heard that and like read articles about that over the years. That is really a challenge. And Adam was saying, in different contexts that he's been in, friendships look different places,
Yeah.
So part of it is like that, probably the specifics of a person's stage of life and like their friendship, like the culture of the communities that they're a part of. But are there some major factors that you see? Like one of the things Adam was talking about for him as like an introvert is just, it can just feel like one more thing that adds pressure to life. Like you don't really have a lot of time to just go watch the new Marvel movie and grab dinner, like investing in a friendship looks like maybe going on a family hike and stopping regularly to tell your kids not to throw rocks, or, partnering with men to help with something at church, which is like a great opportunity, but also, is an additional thing. So like, I guess what are some of the factors that you see that can cause men not to pursue deep relationships?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to list off a few things, not in order of importance or significance, but I think one thing that holds guys back is they haven't had many models of it. Like a lot of the young men I work with, when I ask them about their father's friendships while the children were growing up, it tends to be my father had no friends, or my father had a couple of friends, but they hardly ever got together. So, they didn't grow up seeing this among men. I think, Adam's getting at another part there of just kind of a lack of urgency, meaning, friendship's great, but all the things that are screaming at me right now, this doesn't seem most urgent for me to be building friendships. I think, a lot of times during the college years, for those who go to college, or kind of during that time of life, like late teens, early 20s, men in America are used to just hanging out. So there's a lot of hanging out time then, but then pretty much as they get married, as they get in their career, as they start having kids, all that, then there's just not a easy way for it to happen, because you don't have a lot of time to just hang out. So I think that's a reason. And I think that the downside of that is isolation. And it's funny because they don't look isolated, meaning they have a wife, they have kids, they have people at work, they have people at church. There's people all around them. But, in terms of thinking through a lot of things of life, in terms of being understood by another guy, they don't have that. And sometimes it can really be difficult in marriages, because sometimes guys are almost like wanting their wife to give them what only a friendship with another guy can give them. Like most wives can't understand what it's like to be a man and to understand the challenges that men feel. And so if it's not urgent, if it doesn't happen, then they are left kind of to themselves to figure things out. And that's not a good thing. There's two verses that have kind of pushed me on with this. One in Proverbs that says, he who separates himself seeks his own, He argues against all sound wisdom. And
Hmm.
now when you're choosing to not really go after having friendships with other guys, you don't necessarily feel like you're seeking your own or that you're arguing against all sound wisdom. But in some ways, that's what ends up happening because you don't have input. You don't have the input that another guy could provide for you. And then in John, it says, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains by itself alone. But if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. And there is a dying that comes in building a friendship where you, in some ways, die to yourself, you die to your comforts, so that you don't remain by yourself alone, so that you are that seed that falls into the ground of a friendship and really blossoms.
That's an interesting way to apply it. Yeah. No, that's really good. One, I feel like there was a lot from what you just said. But one thing that I was going to ask you about, because you were talking about then you grow isolated.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like a follow-up question that, again, is from Adam, because you were saying that kind of maybe his particular situation is like the whole, it doesn't feel urgent. I'm sure a lot of men feel that there's a lot that is urgent and this isn't urgent. And so he was like asking, like, what do you think are the long-term impacts when men do become isolated, or like over time, like you're a generation ahead of us.
Yeah.
So what's the trajectory of a man who gets isolated or doesn't develop deep friendships?
And I was mentoring a student one time who had a really great friend, like a really great friend. And I asked him one time, I said, just imagine you and this guy remain friends for the next 20 years. What would be the potential benefits of that? And he said to me, the benefit is that I would be ongoingly reminded as to the kind of man I'm to become. And I will be ongoingly encouraged to become that man. And so I think when you don't have that, you're left with yourself in terms of having a guy support, a man encouraging you, strengthening you to become that. And you have your wife and you have, people that you kind of associate with. But the proverb's right. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens his brother.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I can see, really for men or women, how that could happen. So that's great. Any other thoughts that you had on that one?
Well, just, they miss out on the loyalty, the understanding, and the courage that men can give to each other. And those are some pretty precious things. When you think about Jonathan and David's friendship in the Old Testament, you see that. You see a bond of loyalty between them. You see really a deep understanding, especially Jonathan's understanding of David and of where God had called David and the role he could have in helping him get there. And then just courage. They were both two very courageous men. And you miss out on that. And that is a real loss.
Yeah. No, that's really good. So you've kind of talked about like some of the ways that in David and Jonathan's friendship, some of the positive impacts. Tell me more about that kind of courage that men can help each other gain.
Yeah, well, I think of it as if you take the word encouragement, but instead of spelling it E-N-C-O-U, you spell it I-N. So encouragement. What kind of courage can men put into each other? And a couple of that I've jotted down that have been true in my life and true as I look at different friendships in the Bible and other places. One is the courage to choose against compromise. My closest friend in life is, other than Janet, is a man named Randy, and you know Randy really well. And that's exactly what's been true in our friendship. I think that we have a strong sense, not so much of accountability. We're not really accountable to each other, but we just encourage each other to be the man that God's called us to be and to see how we can help each other not compromise, but to stand forward. So one's the courage to choose against compromise. One is the courage to remember the vision. Like, what is it that God's called you to? What is the kind of man, the vision that he's called you to be a part of? And to remember that. Another one's to join together, the courage to join together and not try to do the hard things in life by yourself. I think you mentioned a minute ago with one of Adam's thoughts, it's harder for men to learn how to raise, say, their sons together in community. But boy, there is such an impact when a young boy is growing up and he has a number of men that he's in relationship with and who are playing a role in his life. So the courage to join together, the courage to see reality as it is. You know, a lot of times men come up with big ideas and yet there's just no way it's going to happen. And to help each other to be able to see that, you know, that's not really possible, but maybe this is, you know. So the courage to admit the reality as it is, the courage to take a break. You know, sometimes men will just run themselves into the ground and lose perspective, lose their health, sometimes lose their family. And to be able to say to your brother, you know, you really need to take some time off. You really need to take a break. You need to get some distance. But kind of similarly, the courage to fully engage, like to really go after it, to stay focused, stay committed. And then finally, the courage to choose honor and wisdom rather than expedience and foolishness. Sometimes as we get tired as men, we just want to find a shortcut. Or sometimes as we get into our midlife years of our early 40s, we are tempted to do some really foolish things. And to have a friend, to have a brother that basically reminds you by his example and by his words to you that we're to choose honor and wisdom and not expedience and foolishness. So for me, those are some of the kinds of courage that I've seen, and I've seen this especially in the Bible with David and Jonathan. I mentioned that in just a few minutes ago, but I think theirs is quite an amazing friendship because, again, two very strong men, two very courageous men. And you remember the story, David had been called to be the successor, the one who would replace Jonathan's father. And Jonathan was the heir apparent. And yet, as soon as Jonathan began to get a sense of what God had called David to, he began to think through how could he resource him. And so he has that private coronation for David where he gives David his sword and his robe, his shield. He gives him the effects or the trappings of the heir apparent. And in that way, to the best of his ability, recognizes the calling that God has on David's life and resources him for that.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome story.
It
So,
sure
I mean,
is.
like that really in a strong, maybe especially like a Christian male friendship, just like humility or putting the other for like, instead of seeking like, what is this giving to me? Like, how can I serve the other?
Exactly. Yes.
So, as you were talking, I was thinking like with some of those different ones about kind of like men calling other men forward. This is something that Adam and I have been talking about just even with our son, Barrett, who's almost 9, and we're homeschooling him, and which is like such a gift. I love getting that time with him and seeing that there's like starting to be some shifts in the way that he like responds to his dad and the way he responds to me, like just he's getting to an age of like the way that men respond to men is just different. And Adam and I have joked also about just with Adam, like I can say something 15 times and, you know, it's like, it just doesn't really like make sense. But then if another man says it, then it's like, it calls him forward in a totally different way. And I'm sure there's equivalents the other direction. Like it's not, but it's just been like that's something I have definitely seen to be the case. So I can see like the calling each other forward and kind of like the benefits of that being a real gift of strong male friendship. Are there costs that you see? I feel like we've touched on a couple, but are there any other things that
Yeah,
are
there are definitely costs. And I guess with anything that's precious in life, there are costs.
Mm-hmm.
A few that have come to my mind is one is just the cost of committing to pursue friendship.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it takes time, and it's in the years of your life when you're very busy a lot of times, but
Mm-hmm.
just committing to do it, figuring out what would it take for me to build a solid friendship or two with a couple of men who we would be committed to encourage, to call each other forward, to help each other out, to just be friends with each other. So it costs commitment, it costs time. You don't hang out all the time. You may only see each other every month or so, or maybe less than that.
Mm-hmm.
But there is some time committed to being together. And when you're together, it gets real. It's not just always just, hanging out, at a concert kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it is real conversations, real life lived together. So it takes time, it takes thought,
Mm-hmm.
where you're considering his life, considering his challenges, his needs, uh, what God's called him to, and thinking and praying about how you can be of help.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it it costs vulnerability and honesty, of being honest about who you really are and where you're really at and what you need.
Hmm.
And for men, that's scary sometimes. It does cost resources sometimes, the resources of doing something together. With Randy and I, we've been friends for, 45 years, I guess now. And only 18 of those years did we live in the same city.
Hmm.
And so for the rest of those years, it's cost plane tickets. It's cost just making time, making a way to be together, And then the last thing is it costs large-heartedness, meaning men can be great friends and they can also drive each other crazy, and it requires having a heart that accepts how the other one's put together. Like when John said to me, "I don't want to be like you," just having the heart to understand that as he meant it. He wasn't meaning that as a judgment towards me, I don't think at all. He was just meaning that God had put him together in some different ways.
Yeah.
And that he wanted to be the man God had put him together to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are some things that it does cost. And again, when you're in your college years, you might have had 8 or 10 or 15 guys you hung out with regularly.
Yeah.
As you go through life as a man, you will be very blessed to have one or two.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do have one or two, that is amazing. That is a great, great blessing.
Well, I feel like you've like cast a strong vision of like just the benefits of this. So for a person who is listening and feels like, man, I do not have this, I don't have one, where does a person begin with building these kinds of friendships?
Yeah. Where do you begin? Well, when we talk to our children about their friendships, a lot of times we'll say to our children, well, you just go out and be a friend to them. And then see how that works out. See if they return the favor. And it's interestingly, I think as men, we are always telling our children that they should have good friendships. Mm-hmm. But then a lot of times as men, we don't really model that for them. And so we almost, tacitly communicate to them, this is really only for children. And when you become an adult, you don't really need friends. Mm-hmm. But I think that where you begin is you have to come to understand the potential value of it, that this really is important. And then I think the way you do it is go out and be that kind of friend to someone else. Learn about their life. Take take their interest into your heart. Begin to pray for them on a weekly basis.
That's good.
And just see how can you be that kind of friend to them, because even if they don't reciprocate, you've still done, I think, what God would have you do, because
that's so good.
Hebrews 3:13 says, that we're to encourage one another day after day, as long as it's still called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And that doesn't say just encourage those who encourage you. It says we're to encourage. And I found in my life that among all the guys out there are plenty of men that if you take an interest in them, if you begin to convey and model friendship to them, there are plenty who will respond and who will, kind of do the same in terms of becoming your friend.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really good. Well, and then I have one more kind of wrap up question related to this. So what about for like wives who are listening to the podcast who hear this and are like, man, I wish my husband had, these kinds of friendships. Like, well, one thing that I have learned that is not helpful is to regularly mention to Adam, you should get lunch with so-and-so. You should ask so-and-so that.
And let me just
don't do
ask.
that. Yeah. So, but do you have any thoughts of like what is helpful for a wife to do just to encourage her husband in this area?
Yeah, well, I think, praying about it for sure is so important. And then I think there maybe are times where a wife can say to her husband, honey, I know this is really hard for you. And it seems to me if you had a guy that you could talk this through with, it would be really helpful. So if there's anything I can do to facilitate that happening, please let me know. In terms of you keeping the kids just on your own one night while he's out or something like that. I think those are the things that come to mind. A lot of times, like with Randy, the way I met Randy was because Janet met his wife, Teresa, and they became friends. And so Janet came up with this great idea about that we were all going to go to a lake together on Memorial Day or something. And I'd never met Randy. And I'm like, Janet, that is a horrible idea. I don't know how you thought this was a good idea. And the same thing's going on with Randy and Teresa, where he's like, why did you ever think this was a good idea? And then, 45 years later. But I think that just shows the point that sometimes women get the need and see the need for friendship quicker than men do. And yet men need it just as much. And I think wives just have to be thoughtful and prayerful about in what ways they can encourage their husbands towards building really great friends.
So basically you're saying if you see this, then it's great to say it once and then just if beyond that, just pray.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's probably what Janet did when I'm like, this is a horrible idea to go to the lake with these people. Yeah. And then here we are.
Well, awesome, Dad. Well, to the extent that, I know that this was generally about male friendships, but I feel like I have a couple of takeaways just as far as realizing the way that just that we as parents are modeling friendships for our kids. When you were talking about how being a friend to other people, no matter what, is going to glorify God.
Yeah.
And is a way to be a blessing to other people. And then God, I feel like that's even, I was thinking with one of my kids, and I mean, definitely I've had times like that too, of like, just trusting God of like, okay, if nothing else, this is a way to be obedient to God. And then probably like there really will be friends that come along as a result of that. So anyways, I thought this was really helpful. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, just a passage from the Word that is a great encouragement here. It's from Ecclesiastes 4. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their work. It's interesting. It's talking about their work. If one falls down, his friend can help him up. But pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. I think that's a great reminder to us that we're not made to go through life alone. And I think the men are not made to go through life absent friendships that help us along the way. So I think to our listeners, our encouragement to you today is just that you begin where you are, you pray about it, you become a really good friend to someone, and then just see how God uses that in their life and maybe in beginning to multiply some life friends for you. And we welcome you to come to the Leadership Edge website for resources, not so much around friendship, but especially around leadership and mentoring. It's lead-edge.com, and you'll find a lot of resources there, and also find out how you can sign up for our next mentor training. With that, Laura, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, Dad. Thanks so much. And thanks, listeners, for joining us.
Listeners, if you would like more perspectives on life, leadership, and mentoring, please go to the Leadership Edge website at lead-edge.com. Or if you have questions or ideas about future podcasts, please reach out to us at lei@lead-edge.com. We look forward to hearing from you.